of northern and northwestern Scotland away from some of the more misty coasts, but the outbreaks of rain do move into northern Scotland by the end of Saturday. And so for most places, well, we've got a lot of cloud on Saturday night, further spells of rain moving up from the south, showery rain, so it's going to be on and off, but with the cloud cover, of course, and the breeze, it's going to be a frost-free night for all of us. Sunday then starts off with a lot of cloud cover, outbreaks of rain or showers, some early showers possible for the London Marathon, but actually a drier interlude, I think, for much of the marathon before showers return later in the afternoon for London. And for elsewhere in the UK, it turns colder later Sunday with a return to overnight frosts Monday and Tuesday.
Monday to Thursday nights on GB News. At 6, it's Dewbs & Co. 7 o'clock, Farage. At 8, join Jacob Rees-Mogg. And at 9, Dan Wootton Tonight, followed by Headliners. On TV, radio and online. This is GB News.
First and foremost, I am a GB News fan, and I was before I was working here. Just love the fact that we're asking the questions that a lot of establishment media won't ask.
With a bit of a twist, we not only want to inform you, but we want to keep you entertained.
It's worth the drive because you get in and the team's all ready and waiting, they're itching to go, and it's a proper little family.
GB News is the people's channel.
It's the audience that makes the programme sing.
We're giving our viewers and our listeners a voice. I see the thousands of your letters, tweets, emails, you name it, coming in.
Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it?
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent you.
It's time for something different. It's time for GB News. I'm very patriotic. I believe in Britain. Our best days lie ahead.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Join us here on GB News.
The people's channel.
Britain's news channel.
Join me, Patrick Christie's, Monday to Friday, 3 till 6. We tackle the day's news agenda like you've never seen before. It's high tempo, high octane, the most controversial topics, and the best guests. You will not be able to take your eyes and ears off it. I'm not afraid to ask the questions that you really want answered. 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
GB News has its own late-night paper preview show, Headliners, where comedians take you through the next day's top news stories. You don't have to bother reading the newspaper, we've got it covered for you. Headliners, every night at 11 p.m, and repeated every morning at 5 a.m. We won't send you to sleep like some of the other paper review shows out there. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Camilla Tominey, on Sunday mornings from 9:30, taking the politicians to task and breaking out of SW1 to see how their decisions are affecting you across the UK. Bursting the Westminster bubble every Sunday morning, only on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain's watching.
Hello, I'm Calvin Robinson. Do not miss my Common Sense Crusade Saturdays at 7 p.m. Join me for some in-depth discussions on faith. Is that not the start of the slippery slope?
It's very much so.
And the big moral questions of the day. I'm baffled.
You've got some nerve.
Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my 2 comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Good evening. Welcome to Dewbs & Co with me, Emily Carver, with you until 7 p.m. What a day. Dominic Raab's forced resignation. What do you make of it? Dominic Raab, in an exclusive interview with GB News' Olivia Utley, has suggested that there may have been activist elements within the civil service who target ministers they may not agree with. What do you make of that? Do you think the threshold for bullying is too low? Or are you with the civil servants, perhaps? Let me know. We'll be debating debating that, we'll be speaking to none other than Jacob Rees-Mogg, Conservative MP and GB News presenter, on that in just one moment. Then Just Stop Oil. Remember those two chaps who decided to scale a bridge and cause mass disruption at Dartford Crossing? Well, they've been given about 3 years each in prison. Is that harsh enough, or is it excessive in your view? Let me know. And the state pension. Should we be more like the French? Should we be rioting in the streets? We know that the state pension is going to go up to 68. It could go up to 70 within 5 years. Do you think we should be out there rioting, or do you think we need to take more personal responsibility for our finances and our retirement? And lastly, cyclists. Should they be mandated to have number plates? Let me know. We've got all of that to come tonight on Dewbs & Co. with me, Emily Carver. But first, let's get the latest news with Aaron Armstrong.
Well, it's 6:01. Good evening to you from the GB newsroom. Dominic Raab says the inquiry into bullying allegations against him was flawed, and it sets a precedent that will have a paralysing effect on government. The former Deputy Prime Minister has spoken exclusively to GB News following his resignation after an inquiry found he'd acted in an intimidating and aggressive way towards staff.
I'm very confident that I didn't behave in a bullying way. Most of these allegations were dismissed out of hand. Being able to pull very senior civil servants, not junior members of staff, up and say, look, I don't have the basic information to decide this. That was one of the things on which I was found to have been bullying because I defended someone, or because I said in relation to human rights reform, to get more foreign national offenders removed from this country, to strengthen free speech, I said I thought the department were being obstructive. If these kind of things amount to bullying, then I think it puts a handbrake, a paralysing effect on ministers delivering for the British people.
Oliver Dowden's replaced Dominic Raab as the new Deputy Prime Minister. He says he's deeply honoured and is looking forward to tackling issues that matter most to the people of this country. He will also remain in his role as the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster. And Alex Chalk takes over as the new Justice Secretary, making him the 11th person appointed in that role since 2010. The MP for Cheltenham has held positions as a Defence Minister, barrister and a former Solicitor General. The Law Society, though, has warned he inherits an even worse justice crisis than any of his recent predecessors. Labour's Shadow Justice Secretary, Steve Reid, has attacked Dominic Raab's record in office, accusing him of leaving the criminal justice system in tatters, with Sir Keir Starmer criticising the Prime Minister over what he calls indecision and weakness in allowing Mr Raab to resign.
Well, the big question for the Prime Minister is why he was so weak to appoint him in the first place. The second question for the Prime Minister is why he didn't sack him. And now it's left to Dominic Raab to resign, and the Prime Minister hasn't acted. And it's that indecision, it's that weakness, I think, that goes to the heart, not just of this Prime Minister, but of 13 years now of failure.
In other news this evening, 2 Just Stop Oil protesters who scaled a bridge over Dartford Crossing last October have been jailed. Morgan Trolan's been sentenced to 3 years and Marcus Decker 2 years and 7 months for causing a public nuisance. The pair argued it was a peaceful protest. The judge disagreed, saying they deserve to be punished for causing chaos and also to deter others from copying them. Just Stop Oil, though, says they are the longest sentences for peaceful climate protest in British history. Braintree District Council has lost its High Court bid to stop a former RAF base in Essex being used to house asylum seekers. The government plans to accommodate as many as 1,700 migrants at Wethersfield Airfield for up to 6 months each. The judge said he didn't have the legal power to grant the council's application for an injunction. The CBI's futures in Dow's, as a number of major firms have quit following fresh allegations of rape against the business group. NatWest and John Lewis have joined other big businesses, including BMW and Virgin Media O2, in cancelling their involvement with the crisis-hit group. The Guardian has reported the alleged victim claims she was raped by 2 male colleagues. The CBI says it is working closely with the police to ensure any perpetrators are brought to justice. Conservative MP Julian Knight says he doesn't want the Tory whip reinstated and he will not stand again at the next general election. It's after police dropped a sexual assault allegation made against him. The MP for Solihull, who was suspended from the party over the claim, has always denied the allegation, describing it as false and malicious. He's tweeted to say it's brought untold damage to his physical and mental health and has caused pain and distress to his family. The Communication Workers Union has reached an agreement with Royal Mail on pay and conditions. It includes a 10% pay rise over 3 years, a profit-sharing agreement, and no compulsory redundancies until at least April 2025. Union members will vote on the deal in coming weeks with a recommendation for them to approve it. And Kensington Palace has released a new photo of the late Queen to mark what would have been her 97th birthday. It shows Queen Elizabeth with some of her grandchildren and great-grandchildren, including Zara Tyndall's kids on the left. The photo was taken by the Princess of Wales at Balmoral last summer, just weeks before the late Queen's death. TV, online, DAB and on TuneIn Radio 2, this is GB News. Now, back to Emily.
Welcome to Dewbs & Co with me, Emily Carver. Now, joining me until 7, I have my panel, Charlotte Pickles, who is the director of the Reform think tank, and Paul Embry, who is an author, fireman and trade unionist, of course. Now, you can get in touch with us about all of the topics I just outlined, particularly that Dominic Raab resignation, that forced resignation over bullying allegations. We'll be talking to Jacob Rees-Mogg in just one moment, but please do keep your views coming in at gbviews at gbnews.uk or on Twitter at gbnews. They're already coming in. I will get to them in just one moment. So, in the last few hours, Dominic Raab has spoken to GB News about his resignation from the government over claims of bullying. The former Justice Secretary warned against what he called a tyranny of subjective hurt feelings, getting in the way of ministers driving change in government. GB News political reporter Olivia Utley began by asking him how he defines bullying.
I don't think it is for me to define it, but look, I'm very confident that I didn't behave in a bullying way. Most of these allegations were dismissed out of hand. And I think people watching this would be surprised that in scrutinising civil servants, in making sure that millions of pounds of taxpayers' money is not squandered, being able to pull very senior civil servants, not junior members of staff, up and say, look, I don't have the basic information to decide this. That was one of the things on which I was found to have been bullying because I defended someone, or because I said in relation to human rights reform, to get more foreign national offenders removed from this country, to strengthen free speech, I said I thought the department were being obstructive. If these kind of things amount to bullying, then I think it puts a handbrake, a paralysing effect on ministers delivering for the British people, and that can't be right.
Do you think, essentially, that the allegations were purely political, or do you think people genuinely felt threatened by you?
That's difficult to say, but the way my behaviour was characterised is interesting. Adam Tolley KC, very experienced barrister who conducted this investigation, found I'd never lost my temper, never over 4.5 years shouted or swore at anyone, but that some people found my direct style of probing, of interrogating, of scrutiny unsettling or discomforting or even offensive. And I think there's a certain tyranny of subjective hurt feelings here, which if you actually apply that across the board, means that senior ministers are at risk as they try and drive forward the change that the British public expect, try and protect taxpayers' money, try and deliver for the British people, can actually hold things back. I think if you look at that across the board, and particularly if you compare it to other walks of life, stressful jobs, high-powered businesses, but other walks of life more generally, I think people would be pretty surprised. The risk, of course, is that it leads government, ministers, politicians to look and feel to the public even more detached from reality.
Well, there we go. That's a clip from our exclusive interview with Dominic Raab. Olivia Utley there interviewing the man himself. So, Charlotte, what do you make of what Dominic Raab just said there? It's clear that he believes the threshold for bullying is just far too low, and that, in a way, a little bit of a stitch-up, one could say, almost.
I think there is a real question mark here as to whether the threshold is set appropriately. Now, obviously, the inquiry that's been done was based on the threshold, the description in the ministerial code. So the problem lies with the ministerial code. But in my view, I don't think that saying someone's work lacks the basics, you know, perhaps being a bit over-enthusiastic in your hand movements, you know, criticising work. I don't think that does constitute bullying.
I mean, I had teachers who did worse than that.
Well, you know, it's interesting. There's a one of the words in the report that we've had today says that he used the word woeful about some work. And I remember having a university tutor who told me in my first, based on my first essay, gosh, that really is terrible, isn't it? And I didn't feel he was bullying me. I mean, you know, I think the idea, you know, for me, bullying is something which is deliberate. It's something which is intentionally aimed at making someone feel inadequate, you know, making someone kind of feel really deeply uncomfortable and attacked. And I think there's a big distinction between a pattern of behaviour with intent and someone who is, as he has described, very direct and very abrasive. I think the one caveat I would give is that I want to have ministers who can get the best out of the civil service. You know, I have worked for a Secretary of State. I worked for IDS as an advisor when he was...
Ian Duncan-Smith.
Sorry, Ian Duncan-Smith, exactly, when he was an advisor in the Department for Work and Pensions. And, you know, we had meetings where I would sit in there and think, this is fantastic, this is brilliant. I also had meetings where I thought, this is terrible, and how on earth are you going to send out a Secretary of State to make a case for this policy with the sort of quality of work? And so I think, you know, you need Secretary of States that get best out of people. You clearly don't want to have a consistent abrasive behaviour. But the idea this is bullying, I think, is a bit of a stretch.
Paul, he talks about a tyranny of subjective hurt feelings. I think those were his words. Do you think that is fair comment?
Well, look, I'm a trade unionist to my core. I've represented people in the workplace who have suffered bullying, and we should all stand against it. I fear that actually the bar for bullying in this Adam Tolley report has been set so low that actually anything almost could constitute bullying. You know, somebody just being demanding, somebody just being assertive in a managerial role could constitute bullying. I mean, the definition includes things like being insulting. Well, let's be blunt. Which of us could say that we've never insulted somebody, even mildly, in the workplace in our time? And the problem is that by the definition of bullying within this report, that would make us all bullies. Now, I want cabinet ministers, I want elected politicians who are running big departments and running the country to be demanding. I want them to be assertive. Obviously, if they're overstepping the line and they are bullying people, then they need to be challenged. But I'm not sure, having read most of the report, I'm not sure what happened in this particular case could genuinely constitute bullying. So I think, you know, there is a danger, and I think Rob has got a point on this, there is a danger that what we are seeing is a kind of emergent activist civil service, and I think that's something that should unite people across politics, whether you're Labour, whether you're Tory or something else, is that that's not the sort of thing you want to see. You don't want to see the tail wagging the dog. You want elected politicians to be running the country and making decisions, not civil servants.
Well, I want to get stuck into that, definitely, but let's just go over some of the allegations, because they do not sound, from what I'm reading anyway, they do not sound like they reach a threshold of bullying to warrant a forced resignation, essentially a sacking. He would raise his voice. He could be rude and aggressive. He engaged in hard staring, looking at people with cold fury. He expected them to have the answers to all of his questions. He would use hand gestures to indicate a person should be quiet. Charlotte, perhaps he was a little bit much on some occasions, a little bit rude, a little bit angry. But in a position as a Minister of State, as a Secretary of State, surely, if your civil servants aren't producing work that is up to scratch, isn't good enough, it's incumbent on him to lay down the law.
Yes, and there are ways of doing that. So I mentioned I was in the Department for Work and Pensions. In this instance, not in Duncan-Smith, but another minister we had there. I can remember doing a meeting on quite a controversial policy that we wanted to do. And we probably had about 8 or 10 civil servants came in and started talking. Clear they didn't have the information we needed. Clear they hadn't even really tried to answer the questions. And the minister said, I'm ending this meeting. Come back when you have the information I need. That was a perfectly legitimate thing to say. Why go through wasting a minister's time if you haven't got the information that they need to make a decision? I think that the thing we need to be clear about is if you're consistently very aggressive, I'm not saying this is bullying at all. I think we have to be clear that there's, I think we've both said we think the threshold is too low to make an accusation of bullying here. But again, an atmosphere where people feel very uncomfortable or an atmosphere where there is kind of an abrasive character, you don't get the best from people if they're fearful. You don't get the best from teams if actually they're really nervous being in front of you.
I completely agree, and no one wants a boss who makes them fearful of coming into work, and that is too often the case. I'm sure all of us have experienced that at one point in our careers or another. But I think the point about ideological differences is a very real one. If we look at who's been accused of bullying in the government in terms of Conservative ministers, it has been Priti Patel, of course, who was trying to get through quite controversial policies that those working in the civil service may not have approved of, Paul. And now Dominic Raab, we know he had conservative views. And knowing civil servants myself, they are not naturally small c Conservatives, a lot of them. Do you think there's a case of civil servants acting against the wishes of ministers, trying to make it difficult for them?
Well, a former Labour MP, Chris Mullin, wrote a fantastic book called A Very British Coup in the early 1980s, and there was more than a kernel of truth, in my opinion, in terms of what he said. And he wrote about how an establishment conspired to prevent a radical Labour government led by a socialist Prime Minister from implementing its radical manifesto. I think that actually, whatever side of the political divide you are, the civil service like things done a certain way, and they become set in their ways. And if they have someone radical, whether it's from the left or whether it's from the right, then I sense that often they will go out of their way to try to resist those ideas being implemented and to try to stop them. I mean, Yes Minister wasn't a complete parody. I mean, anyone in politics will tell you that there was some truth in that as well. Tony Benn, in his diaries, famously wrote about how when he was appointed Secretary of State for Industry in 1974 on the back of a radical Labour manifesto, he was blocked every step of the way by the civil service. I mean, he and his permanent secretary, Sir Anthony Part, used to be at loggerheads with each other, where he tried to get the Radical Labour manifesto through, and Sir Anthony Part and officials within the department blocked him every step of the way. It's really worth reading the Benn diaries. Yeah. And I would say to colleagues on the left, before you jump on the anti-Raab bandwagon, look at the civil service, read the Benn diaries and see sometimes what you're up against.
I also saw that you suggested, where was the uproar from certain Labour MPs when it came to John Bercow's bullying allegations, which arguably were far worse on paper?
Oh, I think there's no question that was bullying. I mean, if you looked at what came out around that, I mean, it was horrendous. I don't think I personally wouldn't put Raab and Bercow in the same category. But Paul's absolutely right. I mean, Tony Blair talked about the scars on my back from trying to overhaul the civil service. There was a piece in the news just this week or last week by Alan Milburn, former Labour Health Secretary, talking about how kind of obstructive at times the Health Department could be in trying to push through reforms, which I don't think you would argue were on the socialist left, but was certainly of it. So I think you're right, this is such a common story throughout. I think, at times, I'm not sure it's almost ideological or intentional on the part of civil servants. I think it is just this is how we do it and we're not going to change it.
Yes, I think it depends on the civil servant, but I do believe Raab when he says there could be some activism going on in the civil service. I mean, a lot of these people who work in the civil service are very political themselves, and that must come out in their conversations. Anyway, coming up, we're going to be talking to Jacob Rees-Mogg in just one moment, and we'll be getting your reaction too.
It's all about family, being in people's living rooms, all the interaction and getting to know who our viewers and listeners are.
When I was young, my dad used to say, no, stop arguing. I wanted an outlet that would enable me to give my opinion
People are going through a really hard time right now, and I know that you don't feel like you're being listened to by the establishment.
I came to GB News because it's the People's Channel, and I want the audience to have their say on the events of the day.
We're dynamic. We do something different. Democracy shows that the wisdom of the nation is in its people.
I get to travel to find out what the story is from a personal perspective.
The British people aren't fools. We know when we're not being told the full story.
We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this.
It's the best country in the world.
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent your views.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry, and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Dewbs and Co.
You're an inspiration to us all.
Clip that bit off.
Well, you are.
That's my ringtone. My political ambitions those days are gone, I can tell you.
She's only teasing. Go on.
He's probably going to want to lay down now. I'll give him 2 minutes now.
Let's respectfully disagree. That's what we like on Dewbs and Co. Come and join us. GB News, the People's Channel.
Michelle Dewberry, weekday evenings at 6 o'clock.
Start the day with GB News.
We catch up on all the big stories you didn't hear the night before.
And take a look at what the world's talking about this morning. That's right, Monday to Thursdays from 6 o'clock. It's Breakfast with Eamon and Isabel.
Straight after breakfast, join us, Bev Turner and Andrew Pearce. We're going to take you through till noon.
We'll be tackling the big topics of the day, including the things that the other channels just won't talk about. If it's happening here. Wake up to mornings on GB News, the People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
I'm Simon Evans. Join me on GB News for Headliners at 11 p.m.
What's the scoop?
I'll be joined by 2 of the country's top comedians.
That's right.
As we take a look at tomorrow's newspapers tonight.
We're going to get into trouble.
If it's a big story, we'll be covering it.
Spill some tea on him.
There we go.
But we'll also have some fun.
I wouldn't stick up a bank.
My father didn't love me.
So anyway, Headliners every night from 11 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
We've got a brand new lineup every Saturday night on GB News.
From 6 p.m, I'll give you my unique take on the world today.
Then at 7, it's me, Calvin Robinson, with my Common Sense Crusade.
New to GB News is the Saturday 5.
5 times the opinion. Join us every Saturday from 8 p.m. as we debate the week's stories.
With us 4, plus a special guest.
And at 9, of course, it's Mark Dolan Tonight. Brand new Saturday nights on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back to Dewbs & Co with me, Emily Carver. Now we can speak exclusively to Conservative MP and GB News presenter Jacob Rees-Mogg to get his reaction. Jacob, thank you very much indeed for joining me this evening. Well, your reaction to today's events?
Well, I don't think that Dominic Raab needed to resign. I don't think the report found he'd done anything improper. And the issue in relation to the Foreign Office that seems to have been the real cause of his resignation is one where civil servants were behaving badly in relation to Gibraltar. And you would have thought any minister would be annoyed when civil servants fail to carry out the policy of the elected government. And I'm afraid this is a terrible shift in power away from those who are democratically elected, democratically appointed, to those who aren't, to the civil service, to the bureaucracy. It's a great mistake that Dominic Raab has been forced out.
Now, Dominic Raab suggested that there may be activists within the civil service targeting ministers who they are ideologically opposed to. Have you seen that?
Well, I think if you look at the report, it's quite clear that a group within the Justice Ministry did get together to decide that they would say how awful Dominic Raab had been, that was quite clearly something that had a number of conversations behind it. They weren't spontaneous complaints. And this seems to me to be disreputable and something that should have been dismissed much more harshly by the investigator than it was. I found a mix with civil servants. I found that some who were very good and very hardworking and others who didn't share the ambition of the government.
Now, this isn't the first Conservative minister that's been accused of bullying. Of course, Priti Patel was as well, Alok Sharma, by civil servants. Do you think there's a trend emerging, or do you think Conservative ministers are particularly aggressive in their roles?
Well, I don't think they are, no. Certainly nobody ever accused me of being aggressive. But these are high-pressure roles, and people working for the Deputy Prime Minister aren't on the teddy bear's picnic. They must expect it to be a tough and robust working environment. I think it's absolutely ridiculous to think that it's going to be anything other than that when you're running the country and decisions have to be made very rapidly and high standards are expected. Dominic Raab sometimes said that work wasn't good enough. Now, you must be entitled to say that as a minister. And there was a lot of fuss about him saying that civil servants should pay attention to the Civil Service Code. Now, whether he said that or not is a matter of dispute. But actually, it seems to me a perfectly reasonable thing to say, particularly when in the specific instance over Gibraltar, it looks as if the civil service were ignoring the democratically elected government's policy, which of course under the Civil Service Code they're not allowed to do. So I think you need to have people with a bit of backbone working in the government, and this snowflakery is damaging for democracy.
Do you think this whole saga may have consequences for that? Will talented, ambitious and ministers or potential ministers, strong work ethic and high standards, be put off from entering cabinet, perhaps?
No, I wouldn't say that. What I think is more insidious is that ministers will be less willing to follow robust policies because they will be worried that civil servants will complain if the minister pushes for a particular policy or rejects a piece of work that is not good enough. And inevitably some pieces of work are not good enough and need to be revised. And I'm all in favour of good manners. I think politeness is very important and it oils the wheels of so many things. Nonetheless, the government of the country has to be carried on and carried on effectively. Sometimes these are in high-pressured situations and there isn't necessarily the time to say all the pleases and thank yous that you might say at a maiden aunt's dinner party.
Just very lastly, Jacob, why do you think Rishi Sunak, the Prime Minister, has not stood by Dominic Raab if what you say is true, that the threshold for bullying was too low and that Dominic Raab has not done anything explicitly wrong in his conduct? Why has Rishi Sunak allowed him to resign, forced him to resign?
Well, you'll have to ask the Prime Minister's spokesman why, but I think it's a mistake. I think it makes forming governments harder, that the government of the country must be appointed by the King's First Minister. That is the Prime Minister who has the mandate from the House of Commons to decide who ministers should be. It shouldn't be farmed out to unelected officials, to panjandrums and to the moaning minis in some civil service outlets.
Thank you very much indeed. Jacob Rees-Mogg, their Conservative MP, and of course a GB News presenter who'll be back on Monday, I believe. So let me reintroduce my panel. Charlotte Pickles, Director of the Reform think tank, and Paul Embry, author, fireman and trade unionist. Well, Charlotte, your reaction to what Jacob said there, he's not impressed by what Rishi Sunak has done, not standing by Dominic Raab.
As far as I'm aware, when it's a resignation, that's something that Dominic Raab has decided to do. I think in his resignation, he said that he had obviously asked for this inquiry and that if the inquiry found that he had, acted in a way that appeared to breach the ministerial code, that he would resign. And he's done, in his eyes, the honourable thing. I think clearly we've all said we think the bar is set too low. I think by definition, therefore, think he probably shouldn't have needed to resign. But that was his decision. And I think clearly it's not a happy decision, but it's a decision he's taken. The Prime Minister is, I think, not really, from a political sense, in a position to turn around and say, no, I won't accept your resignation, and actually I want you to stay in place. I think that's a bit of political naivety to think that the Prime Minister would do that. So, if someone resigns, ordinarily the Prime Minister will accept that resignation.
Is that right, Paul?
Yeah, I think that's probably true. And, we need to remember that these civil servants, by the way, involved in some of this stuff, they were not junior officials. They were seasoned, senior civil servants at the top of the tree who themselves have a job with considerable power and responsibility. And frankly, should not be shrinking violets. If they are shrinking violets, then they're in the wrong position, as far as I can see. So I think Jacob Rees-Mogg had a point, actually. And I do wonder And I think it's relevant to at least float the idea, whether this is actually a generational thing. I mean, going back to the Tony Benn thing that I mentioned earlier, his permanent secretary, Sir Anthony Parr, almost wore those battles he had with Tony Benn as a badge of honour. He gave media interviews later on in his life where he talked about how they would be at each other's throats in these meetings where Benn wanted something done a certain way and Parr thought that it was wrong. There was no suggestion that Sir Anthony Parr, who himself was a permanent secretary, a seasoned official, in any way took offence at Tony Benn going for him in those meetings and making certain demands. I just wonder today if it's a generational thing where people think, actually, if I'm in a meeting with somebody, I expect complete politeness and courtesy. And if anyone takes a robust line with me or in any way criticises me, I'm offended and actually I can make a complaint.
It's just unrealistic, isn't it? Although, personally, I hate passive aggression. That's what I hate in the workplace. I'd rather someone told me my work was rubbish and not good enough than sort of, you know, made passive-aggressive comments every now and again, but that's just me.
Clearly, Rob was, you know, he's not, I don't think he's the sort of person I would want to go dancing with particularly. He's not really my cup of tea. I think he's probably abrasive. I think he's probably petulant. But, you know, lots of people can be abrasive and petulant when they're in positions of power. I'm not convinced within this report that what's shown actually amounts to bullying. I really don't think
But we probably don't want, so I absolutely agree, it doesn't amount to bullying, but we probably don't want ministers who should be behaving at the highest standards, behaving in a petulant way, if indeed he did.
Yes,
you know, we would hope
agreed.
that they had greater confidence and greater ability to deal with these situations in a more professional manner, if the allegations are accurate.
That's true, and I mean, personally, I don't know. None of us were in the room with Dominic Raab at that moment. He may have been particularly frustrating, aggressive and rude as well. We don't know, but does it mean bullying? Does it mean he should resign? That is the big question. But coming up, we're moving off Dominic Raab. Are you looking forward to a comfortable retirement? Apparently that's going to be getting harder and harder. A leading think tank says the state pension age could hit 70 within the next 3 decades. Good idea, bad idea?
I joined GB News because I was sick and tired of not hearing my views being represented, not just mine, but so many people that I knew and spoke to.
I just couldn't get my voice out there. I couldn't say anything. I couldn't do anything. Whatever the narrative was, I kind of had to follow it.
GB News is there to provide a voice for those who have been ignored by the establishment media. We think different things, we've got a different style.
GB News is here to be optimistic and positive about the future.
It's real kind of dynamic and flowing, with the audience very much at the heart of it, like a big family.
Here at GB News, we talk about the things that matter to you.
Hearing the voices from right across our towns and cities, especially our towns.
All sides of the argument represented with a heavy dose of opinion.
We're on a mission here to make a difference.
And the GB News family really is here for you, and whatever time of day you can watch or listen.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News,
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel. Westminster is going around in ever-decreasing circles, followed by the media. Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it? Join me at 7 p.m, Mondays to Thursdays on Farage. Here on GB News, we will have open, rational debate. We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this. Join us here on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain is watching.
You've probably seen politicians interviewed 1,000 times, but we do it differently. We find out who they really are, we don't shout, we chat, and hopefully we bring a bit of light, not just heat. Did you know Kate Moss?
Apparently.
Do you have a pair of jeans or a pair of jeans?
No, of course I don't. What would I do with them?
My friends are like, oh my God, what's she doing now? Join me every Sunday at 6 for Gloria Meets, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Jacob Rees-Mogg, the Member of Parliament for North East Somerset and a former government minister. For years, I've walked the corridors of power in both Westminster and the City of London. We need to have the arguments, the discussions on how we make it better.
Crop failures, famine, war, suffering on a scale completely unimaginable.
We are putting the cart before the horse. As Charles I said at the scaffold, he was the true defender of liberty.
Yeah, I've completely derailed the conversation.
Join me Monday to Thursday at 8 p.m. on GB News, Britain's news channel.
I'm Mark White. As GB News Home and Security Editor, I cover those key issues that are so important to you. Are authorities, are communities doing all they can to combat violent crime? With the public services under unbearable strain, why are we still failing to control our borders? Defence, the first priority of any government, has been continually hollowed out. Can we trust our politicians to protect the armed forces? Join me, Mark White, on GB News.
I'm on GB News.
You're watching Dewbs & Co with me, Emily Carver. Keeping me company this evening until 7 o'clock is Charlotte Pickles, Director of the Reform think tank, and Paul Embry, author, fireman and trade unionist. So your views on the Dominic Raab resignation. Rob says, as a civil servant, it's a shame Raab has been forced out. Please remember his issues are with director levels refusing to follow the government's agenda. Us on the lower levels also feel frustrations when the directors are telling us to do one thing against the wishes of the government. We aren't all lefty-leaning after all. Well, that's very interesting indeed, that comment there. Peter says, what happened today to Dominic Raab should be a wake-up call to all ministers. They should start sacking civil servants that underperform if they are not doing the job they were employed to do. Well, there's a question about capability, isn't there? Charlotte, we were discussing earlier. And also Susan says, the exclusive interview with Raab was great. Brian says, what an excellent interview by GB News. Questions were asked, time given for answers. No interruption from the interviewer, unlike other news channels. Very good, GB News. That's high praise for Olivia Utley, our political reporter. Excellent stuff. Keep your views coming in, please do. But we're moving on. Are you looking forward to a comfortable retirement? If you're already close to it, then you should be fine for now. But for those of us further down the road, the existing state pension might be more of an aspiration than a nailed-on right. The Institute for Fiscal Studies says the state pension age could hit 70 in the next 3 decades. It looks like the onus on funding your retirement may fall back on us as individuals. Is that right? Charlotte, what do you think?
I think it's firstly quite important to say that there's no suggestion that there won't be a state pension, or indeed that the state pension will be relatively less generous than it is now. So I'm not sure the state pension is really the issue here. The question is, are people saving enough to top up what you get from the state? And a large number of the people who are retiring at the moment, I'm sure you'll get inundated with people saying, I don't have this from viewers at the moment, but a large chunk of people who either are retired or are retiring at pension age have much more generous pensions, something called a defined benefit pension, which essentially means a guaranteed amount that your employer will give you. Indeed, this is also very common in the public sector, whereas people coming through now are not going to have that, and they're not saving enough. So I don't think it's so much about the state pension, it's about, are we as individuals being responsible and putting some money aside so that when we hit retirement, we are going to have a comfortable combination of the state pension and private pensions that we've invested into.
But of course, if it kicks in later, you will be receiving less money over the course of your life.
Yeah, I mean,
if it was 70, then you would have far fewer years potentially.
Well, you'd have about 2 years less because it's already going up to 68. I feel like this is just, when people say, oh, it's going up to 70, all right, but it's already going up to 68, so it's a couple of years longer. Life expectancy is quite significant. So when the pension was introduced, I think it was something like 1908, and it was incredible to introduce this pension. Life expectancy was younger than the age at which you could get your pension. Pensioners now can live for decades reliant on taxpayers funding that. Now, again, people will be writing in and saying, no, I've paid for that. You haven't. You've paid for a certain number of years, but actually there's no pot. You're not saving in terms of your state pension into a pot. Actually, it's working people, it's you and I here, who are paying for that older generation's pensions. And there are fewer of us.
The average person will receive more than they put in through taxes. I've seen statistics to show that. Paul, there seems to be an unfortunate intergenerational war going on at the moment. Whenever the pension age is debated, we see younger people in their 20s and 30s saying, it's so unfair, I'm having to fund through my taxes, older people who are retiring too late, living very long, getting all of these extra benefits and things. I really, really hate that argument, but is there any truth?
No, not really. I mean, there may be in some cases, but by and large, I think pensioners in this country do have it. Well, millions of pensioners, I think, and people of an older generation do have it quite tough and are affected by the cost of living crisis as much as anybody else. And I just think when it comes to any proposal to increase the pension age, I've argued on this channel before, it needs to be driven by health and life expectancy considerations, not by economic considerations. Now, for many years, as we know, life expectancy was rising in this country and across the Western world. Actually, that is not so clear-cut now, particularly in the wake of the pandemic and, health concerns, people now suffering as a result of previously undetected cancers and heart diseases and excess deaths and everything else. I think the case that life expectancy is on some kind of inexorable path upwards, I just don't think is convincing at the moment. So it strikes me as probably the worst possible time that we could talk about an increase in the pension age. And, let's be blunt, people's health starts to deteriorate really when they get to around their 60s. I think most people are reasonably fit and healthy and can function in a normal way up until about their 50s. And it tends to be when they get to their 60s that health concerns and fitness concerns start really to kick in. And if those people are told, actually, you've got to work longer before you can get a pension, and they're not able to, we're going to see thousands of people in impoverishment potentially, and that's something we need to avoid.
But, Paul, we do need to think about the sustainability of the public finances. How much does the state pension cost us every year? 100 billion?
Yeah, I think it's just over. And that's the point. So, of course, it would be lovely if, we could all retire at the age of 50 or let's say 60 and, be completely comfortable on money the state is giving us. But if you also want other public services, if you want a health service, if you want an education system, if you want good transport, if you want good, robust defence, then you actually have to make decisions about how you spend public finances, because you either have to borrow more, and let's be clear, this year we will have spent £120 billion just on servicing our debt because of the amount we've borrowed. So you either have to borrow more or you have to put taxes up. And who are you putting taxes up? The working people who are funding.
I will tell you exactly who to put taxes up.
Okay, because you need to
hang on, I want to ask you
find 100 billion
This
of
is
taxes.
2 to 1 there.
I want to ask you if we should be rioting like the French, but I'll let you have your piece on this.
Not yet. Well, no, I don't believe in writing at all. I mean, look, a wealth tax on the rich, a wealth tax on the 1% of the richest people in this country would bring in billions, in fact, to be able to fund our public services and give people a decent pension in retirement. Why not a windfall tax on the banks, which are currently making huge profits as a result of the rise in interest rates?
You're too old and wise
Why
for
not?
this student.
No, there's nothing wise about what we're hearing here. I'm sorry.
Exactly,
what about a tax on the record profits, the excess and unexpected
people in the country,
on the record profits that some of our corporations are registering at the moment?
Okay, and when they leave, it'll be you and I who are taxed more, and then
they'd be holding the country to ransom.
A windfall tax is a one-off tax by definition, but you're talking about increasing a pension age, which is billions. You need 100 billion extra a year to be able to fund this. A windfall tax doesn't even touch the edges of that, unless you're going to have a windfall tax every year, which no longer is a windfall tax.
But if we scrap non-dom status, then
which will get you nowhere close.
That's merely one option out of a suite of options which would bring in billions of pounds.
Take your welfare, take your wealth tax. So other countries have tried this. They've said we're going to put, say, 2% on people who have a certain amount of wealth. And what most countries have found is it doesn't work. And I think we should be better at taxing wealth, but you can't just have a generic wealth tax. It doesn't get the money because so much wealth is mobile. So what you'll end up doing is you'll end up taxing people, in fact, probably the 1 in 4 pensioners that are millionaires right now. You'll probably end up taxing people who have got immobile assets. So basically people who are earning money in this country via the PAYE system, which isn't most rich people, let's face it, very rich people, or people with property. But what about those people who've spending all their money on very fine art or collectible wines and jewellery and things like that that you can't track?
Of course,
we'll seize it from their hands.
But it's such a simplistic. We hear this all the time. Just have a wealth tax. You absolutely can be smarter on taxing property. We've got a really regressive system for taxing property. We could raise more money, but you're going to get nowhere close via taxing wealth.
Very brief final word.
Those with vested interest, particularly the rich, will always shout down the idea of a wealth tax because they say, no, we'll just move abroad.
I'm not very
rich.
No, we'll just move abroad. No, we'll take our money out of the country.
France.
That, to me, is holding the country to ransom.
Sadly, I wish your
Unfortunately, we
ideas
never leveled that accusation.
I wish it was as simple as that.
You should control capital.
On the pensions, though, Adrian says, Emily, we should be allowed to retire at 65, make way for younger people and those that have never worked. 68 or even 70 is too long to work for those with manual, heavy jobs. Retire and enjoy it, not when you're about to go in your box. Well, fair point. Fair point there from Adrian. Coming up, 2 Just Stop Oil activists who blocked the Dartford crossing are sent to jail for more than 5 years in total. Is that too harsh, or is it fair, or not enough?
Monday to Thursday nights on GB News. At 6, it's Dewbs & Co. 7 o'clock, Farage. At 8, join Jacob Rees-Mogg. And at 9, Dan Wootton Tonight, followed by Headliners. On TV, radio and online. This is GB News.
First and foremost, I am a GB News fan, and I was before I was working here. Just love the fact that we're asking the questions that a lot of establishment media won't ask.
With a bit of a twist, we not only want to inform you, but we want to keep you entertained.
It's worth the drive because you get in and the team's all ready and waiting, they're itching to go, and it's a proper little family.
GB News is the people's channel.
It's the audience that makes the programme sing.
We're giving our viewers and our listeners a voice. I see the thousands of your letters, tweets, emails, you name it, coming in.
Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it?
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent you.
It's time for something different. It's time for GB News. I'm very patriotic. I believe in Britain. Our best days lie ahead.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Join us here on GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Join me, Patrick Christie's, Monday to Friday, 3 till 6. We tackle the day's news agenda like you've never seen before. It's high tempo, high octane, the most controversial topics, and the best guests. You will not be able to take your eyes and ears off it. I'm not afraid to ask the questions that you really want answered. 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
GB News has its own late-night paper preview show, Headliners, where comedians take you through the next day's top news stories. You don't have to bother reading the newspaper, we've got it covered for you. Headliners, every night at 11 p.m, and repeated every morning at 5 a.m. We won't send you to sleep like some of the other paper review shows out there. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Camilla Tominey, on Sunday mornings from 9:30, taking the politicians to task and breaking out of SW1 to see how their decisions are affecting you across the UK. Bursting the Westminster bubble every Sunday morning, only on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain's watching.
Hello, I'm Calvin Robinson. Do not miss my Common Sense Crusade Saturdays at 7 p.m. Join me for some in-depth discussions on faith. Is that not the start of the slippery slope?
It's very much so.
And the big moral questions of the day. I'm baffled.
You've got some nerve.
Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my 2 comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
This is Dewbs & Co with me, Emily Carver. Keeping me company this evening is Charlotte Pickles, director of the Reform think tank, and Paul Embry, author, fireman and trade unionist. So, 2 Just Stop Oil activists, the ones who blocked the Dartford crossing for almost 2 days, have now been sentenced to a total of 5.5 years in jail between them. 40-year-old Morgan Trowland will serve 3 years, while 34-year-old Marcus Decker will serve 2 years and 7 months. The judge made clear the prison terms were intended as a deterrent to stop others from copying the stunt. Charlotte, do you think this sentence will stop Just Stop Oil protesters from taking this kind of action?
I mean, you certainly have to be incredibly committed to the cause to accept 3 years in prison as the result. I mean, I'm really torn on this one. I genuinely am not sure what I think because, on the one hand, I I mean, I don't think you should be able to shut a main bridge for 40 hours, back up traffic. You know, the economic impact, the human impact. I mean, I think we've heard there was a heavily pregnant woman, someone who couldn't get to the funeral of a best friend as a result of this. So, you know, the cost of doing this is huge. And it's not like blocking just a single road. You know, when it's a bridge, you know, there are limited ways you can get across, right?
Crossing is quite major.
It's quite a major piece of infrastructure. So on the one hand, I kind of think good for the judge. Like, we can't have this, and we have seen, you know, so much of it. If you think about the blocking the motorways, etc. On the other hand, they're quite serious jail sentences when you think about some of the crimes that we hear about that get either a similar tariff or less than that. So I do think that I'm slightly uncomfortable with the idea that something like that could end you know, you could end up with a tougher sentence for that than you could for, you know, violence or something.
It's interesting you say that because, of course, there were 100 or so lawyers who signed some kind of declaration of consciousness or whatever they called it, conscience, saying that they would not prosecute eco-protesters. Perhaps this judge, it seems very likely this judge took a very different view and thought, actually, he said himself, you have to be punished for the chaos you caused and to deter others from copying you. This is clearly to set an example, a strong example, that you can't get away with this stuff anymore.
Yeah, and the truth is, as Charlie said, people are walking free who have been convicted of crimes far worse than what these individuals did. These people are a pain in the backside, by the way. I mean, I really lost my rag when they disrupted the snooker last week. I mean, that was the straw.
That was the red line.
That was the straw that broke the case. You can close the Dartford Tunnel, the main artery around London, but if you're going to disrupt the snooker, which is pretty much, I know they wear bow ties, but it's pretty much a working class sport, and obviously most of these protesters are middle class university graduates, and it just seems to me that they're constantly targeting the wrong people. And not taking people with them. I mean, as a trade unionist, I've been involved in quite a few campaigns myself where you're trying to win public support and you have to employ tactics that actually take people with you. And it's almost as if this group has been infiltrated by sleeper agents who are deliberately trying to turn the public against them. I mean, that said, as I said, I think the sentences probably are a bit stiff, but it deserved a custodial sentence because you can't continue doing this stuff, disrupting people's lives and expecting there not to be any
It's interesting you say this because it seems like my followers are more authoritarian than you two. I tweeted whether 3 years was excessive punishment or a necessary deterrent, and a lot of people said it should have been more. Made my day. 3 cheers for the judge. He's obviously one of us. Excellent, as he likes heights so much, he can be put to work on the prison roof and left there. All sorts of comments like this. Some people found it quite amusing, which I can imagine. Right, well, we've only got a couple of minutes left, so I'm going to go straight to the cyclists because lots of you have been getting in touch about whether they should have to have number plates, you know, in the case of collisions or dangerous cycling. Paul, what's your view?
Yes, I think they should. I think that cyclists can be a menace, not all of them, before people start writing in, but some of them can be a menace. I mean, the machines these days go so fast, they pedal furiously. If they impact someone, they can kill, they can maim, they can cause serious injury, and often they're riding on the pavements, which I think there should be a serious sanction for people who do that. So
3 years in prison for that.
It seems, well, I go for 10 personally, but it seems to me that if you're riding one of these machines, which has got the real potential to cause harm, then there's no reason why it shouldn't be licensed, I don't think.
Charlotte?
I mean, I think that is a reasonable position, actually. And, you know, I myself, in fact, not long ago, in fact, when the tube strikes were on, which we won't get into, but
let's
get into that. That'd be a fun one, wouldn't it? But, you know, I found myself going on a long walk through London trying to get to where I needed to go, and went across a road. It was a red light for the cars, and a cyclist came straight through, and luckily wasn't going fast, but hit me coming through. Because
we could have been harmed.
I mean, well, do you know what? I could have palmed him. I could have been like, you know, that's... But nothing happened. But you do just sort of think there's a kind of attitude with some cyclists that they sort of own the place.
Yes.
So I think there is something in that. But, you know, would I prioritise it as something that I wanted to make law? Probably not.
Well, let's see what people have to say. Brian says,
Cyclists should be required to be registered, have a warning bell buzzer, lights, and wear high-vis clothing. Yes, perhaps that should be a bare minimum for cycling. Although, imagine in the countryside...
Including when they're not on the bike, by the way.
Imagine in the countryside, though, if you were, you're just getting on your bike and you have to register and get a number plate and all sorts. Perhaps this could just be for inner cities.
I prefer to ban them in the countryside, because you get stuck behind a cyclist on a country road, that should be illegal.
And Peter says number plates and insurance, policing and stopping cyclists for being on pavements and ignoring traffic lights would be a start. Well, that is all we've got time for this evening. Thank you for tuning in to Dewbs & Co. With me, Emily Carver. Michelle Dewberry will be back on Monday evening. I'll see you tomorrow on Saturday 5 at 8 p.m. But next up, we have got the magnificent Lawrence Fox.
Hello there, I'm Greg Dewhurst and welcome to your latest broadcast from the Met Office. The weekend is looking fairly unsettled. We will see some heavy showers, longer spells of rain, but I'm hopeful there'll be some sunny spells in between. But it is going to be rather cool, particularly by the end of the weekend into the beginning of next week. Looking at the bigger picture, low pressure is developing and in charge of the weather as we move through the weekend, and into the beginning of next week just slides away, allowing a colder northerly air to develop across the country. This evening, cloudy across the central swathe of the UK into the early hours, some heavy rain possible at times. Either side of this, drier with some clear spells, some mist and fog patches across southern England. Touch of frost under the clearer spells, but temperatures holding up where it's cloudy and rainy. Lows of 6 or 7 degrees here, -1 or -2 under those clear spells. But it means bright start for some across southern areas, a few mist and fog patches quickly clearing, and it's not long though before further cloud and showery rain pushes into southern parts of England, whilst Northern Ireland, southern Scotland, northern England having a cloudy day, outbreaks of rain here.